Great to have you on the programme, General Hodges, this evening. First of all, just step back a second, because if I'm right in saying you were one of the key signatories. You sent an open letter to British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, to US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. 2 months ago, you called for a lifting of restrictions on weapons of the West to strike deep into Russia back then. So this is something you felt strongly about for a while. Tell us why and how you feel about the decision by President Biden this week.
Well, obviously, I'm happy that President Biden finally did this. It should have been done 2 years ago. You can see how much the Russians dread Ukraine having this capability now that can destroy Russian headquarters, Russian logistics, Russian artillery. That's what the Russians have wanted to avoid. They know that they cannot win this war unless the West quits. The war actually started, as you know, and your listeners know, back in 2014. And after almost 11 years, Russia, with every advantage, still only controls about 18% of Ukraine. Their economy is in tatters. They can only hope that we will quit. This is why they have launched this intermediate range missile. It's a sign to me of their desperation.
We're going to talk about President Putin's response in a minute, Ben, but I'm really interested just to take your point a bit further. So you talk about these, what you call highly defended strategic targets. You talked about, headquarters, ammunition depots, sites that are key to launching offensives. You've said before, I think, to deal with the sheer mass, the bulk of Russian troops, which has that advantage over Ukraine, you can only really deal with that successfully through precision. Tell us about that.
So, well, thank you. And you've touched on it very, very clearly. The advantage that Russia has of mass numbers. So, like, think of the 50,000 Russian and North Korean troops that are being assembled to attack the Ukrainian bridgehead in Kursk. Most of them are not well trained, particularly the Russian troops. So they're mass. And the way the Russians employ them is by pounding the Ukrainian defenses over and over and over with artillery and rockets. So to coordinate these things, you have to have tactical headquarters, and you have to have the artillery and rocket launchers, and then you have to have tens of thousands of rounds of artillery ammunition. So if you can eliminate those three things, it really undermines Russia's only advantage. And that's exactly what the Ukrainians did on the first chance to use the ATACMS. They struck a large ammunition storage point in Bryansk, which is about 180 kilometers inside Russia, so not exactly deep inside Russia. And then, of course, the Storm Shadows were used to strike a Russian and North Korean headquarters. So I think this is exactly what Ukraine needs to do, and it looks to me that that's what they are targeting first.
And those Storm Shadows have proved very effective, haven't they, in the past as well? Last year in Crimea, hitting the HQ, 34 Navy Russian staff killed. They actually don't have their fleet in Crimea anymore, the Black Sea Fleet, as a result of that. From your perspective now, though, the US, the Pentagon saying today this wasn't an escalation, and yet we've seen the complete opposite in terms of rhetoric from Russia, aren't we? We're hearing from Vladimir Putin to say that this is a continuing escalation, and this is our response, this intermediate intercontinental ballistic missile. Tell me your thoughts on that and why it's causing such consternation in Europe.
Well, I think that the Russians know that they're not going to use a nuclear weapon. I mean, they're not going to start a nuclear conflict because Ukraine destroyed an ammunition storage point. I mean, let's be practical and think through what we're talking about here. They're not going to start a nuclear war because there are zero positive or upsides for Russia if they do this. China and India have both told Russia, do not use a nuclear weapon, mainly because they don't want disruption of their access to cheap Russian gas. The United States has said catastrophic consequences if you use a nuclear weapon. And there's no effect on the battlefield that will give Russia any kind of advantage if they employ a tactical nuclear weapon. So they know that they're not going to do this, but they also know that there are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. and in some European capitals that are terrified at the idea that, oh my God, Russia might use a nuclear weapon. And so the Russians exploit that fear by doing exactly what they just did.
It's a good point, and actually echoed as we're speaking. Actually, we're just hearing from where you are in Germany, Annalena Baerbock, German foreign minister, saying that, quote, the best protection for peace in Europe is supporting self-defense to Ukraine. She goes on to say, playing with fear is the recipe that Putin uses best. It's a recipe that he uses best, but seems to use it with some degree of success. Listen to the rhetoric of Donald Tusk today, the Polish Prime Minister, saying there's a serious risk of heading towards a global conflict. What do you make of that? Because there is this careful balance, isn't there, right now, of balancing rhetoric of fear versus a real reality. Do you see a mismatch in what Donald Tusk is saying, or do you think he's right?
Well, I think that European leaders, especially in Poland, they live close to the threat. I mean, not only do they touch Russia in Kaliningrad, but they also have Belarus and Ukraine right there. And Poland has a history with Russia that's there's nothing good about that history. So of course, they're concerned, which is why Poland is doing so much to build up their own defenses. They've really become a leader in the alliance. And I suspect that they are not quite sure what the new U.S. administration is going to do. So it seems to me that Prime Minister Tusk is one of the leaders in Europe that is going to represent a new center of gravity for defense and security. So I pay attention to what he says.
Let's take a look, because you just touched upon very clearly, actually, the Storm Shadow, the ATACMS, the American missiles, plus this intermediate intercontinental missile from Russia. Let's just take a look at the details that we have of their capabilities. So if we're looking at the British, French-made Storm Shadow Scalp, range of up to 250 kilometres, speed of 1,000 kilometres an hour. Then we look at the stronger, the ATACMS, suitably named, the US ballistic missiles, up to 300 kilometres range, 3,700 kilometres an hour. And then we go up to the Orishnik, essentially the hazelnut tree, the translation there, hypersonic intermediate range ballistic, the Russian, used in Dnipro yesterday, up to 5,000 kilometres, a significant range, 10,000 kilometres an hour. Vladimir Putin say that's around 3 kilometres a second. So just talk us through militarily your thoughts around that and why there is such concern, or whether there is whether there is credence and reason to be concerned.
Well, of course, Russia has been attacking civilian targets from the beginning. I wish that the international community would be more concerned about Russia's daily war crimes, the killing of civilians. Every single Russian officer that is in the chain of command that makes targeting decisions or launches any of these strikes, their names should be public, their faces should be on milk cartons, and they should know that they are never going to live in peace until they've been held to account. So that's one part of this. The second part of this, and your graphic there was actually very instructive. The range of the weapons that the U.S. and U.K. and France have provided to Ukraine are clearly tactical level weapons. I mean, 300 kilometers. You can barely reach inside of Russia with weapons like that. And of course, they're used to take out the headquarters and the logistics, as we just talked about, or the way they use the Storm Shadows in Sevastopol, again, to which you alluded earlier, to destroy the maintenance facility in Sevastopol as well as the headquarters. Exactly what these things are intended to do. The 5,000 kilometer range of this intermediate range missile, that's a completely different kind of weapon. So when we talk about who's escalating, first of all, there's no need or there's no benefit in getting into an argument or who did it first, who's responsible. This war could end tomorrow if Vladimir Putin said, I was wrong. I violated Ukrainian sovereignty. I've been killing civilians. We're stopping it. We're pulling out. Of course, he's not going to do that unless he sees that the West is not going to give in to their scaremongering. We know this from history, that if you look weak, that's what provokes aggression. But if you stand up, if you're strong, and we provide Ukraine, who by the way, Ukraine's doing all the fighting. They're not asking any of us to do anything except give them the tools. This war could have ended last year, actually.
Let's have a listen, General Hodges. This is Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister in Russia, just a few hours ago, and he was well, publicly at least, calibrating perhaps what he called a difficult relationship, a bad legacy that Joe Biden is putting on what could come with Donald Trump. Let's take a listen.
Но что касается реакции на наш ответ, я так понимаю, Зеленский испугался.
Regarding the reaction to our response, as I understand it, Zelensky got scared. He directly began to accuse his hosts of leaving him unarmed in the face of such an action by Russia. Well, this is probably a useful result, because it allowed at least to be closer to reality, to feel it on your own skin, I would say. As for what to expect from Biden and his outgoing administration, well, ATACMS supplies and allowing the British and French to use Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles, of course, is an act of leaving a bad legacy to the next administration.
General Hodges, I'm going to put this point to you, and I'll also bring in Emmanuel Chaz, our correspondent in Kyiv as well, listening and bring into this conversation. But General Hodges, just your thought there on the idea of the Trump presidency. I know one thing I've heard you talk about before in recent months, that if there are negotiations, there is a concern that Russia can just slow roll them effectively, continue pounding targets and say, well, we're trying, we're negotiating, it's not our fault.
Well, of course, I expect that Russia will continue to deny responsibility for any of this, even though they obviously, and I think all serious people know, that Russia was the aggressor back in 2014 and has continued to be doing that. They're the ones that are killing civilians, not the Ukrainians. Now, I think that the Biden administration did a good job on keeping 50 nations, leading 50 nations, to stay focused on support for Ukraine. But the mistake that the Biden administration made was that they failed the critical test of clearly identifying why this is important for us, that this is not charity for Ukraine. This is for security and stability in Europe, as well as for the United States. It's about our economies. It's about making Russia live within its own borders, and also, of course, about deterring China. So if the president had been more clear about that, we would have had much better policies. Capabilities would have been delivered by all of us. And like I say, I think this war should have ended last year. Listening to Foreign Minister Lavrov, who used to be one of the more, let's say, respected diplomats in Europe, he's the one that's going to have the terrible legacy, because he's been continuing to push the lies and the false narratives from the Kremlin, and a legacy of failure, because Russia is probably only a year away from actually being completely done from an economic standpoint with this war.
General Hodges, I want to ask you about Germany in a moment. I just want to bring in Emmanuel Chaz, our correspondent in Kyiv. Emmanuel, listening to Ben Hodges there, making clear just this fear game being played by Vladimir Putin as he sees it, as Annalena Baerbock in Germany, the foreign minister, also sees this as well. Just tell me about the reality on the ground in Kyiv today. I understand there was a session in Parliament cancelled today because of concern of another attack.
Yes, there were concerns that the parliament might be under attack during an air raid alert. That's why it was evacuated. That being said, Ukrainians today are not more worried than they were yesterday. They know who is targeting them, and that's Russia. They have identified their aggressor since 2014, like Ben Hodges aptly reminded us. And of course, people here are very scared of those air raid alerts, of that risk of being targeted, because, as we've mentioned, civilians are targeted by Russia here in Ukraine. However, they know what Russia is capable of. We also heard Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, saying in one of his latest addresses, our crazy neighbor has used a new missile against us. He cannot stand that people are living in dignity and freedom just in the neighboring country, and he's, as usual, fear-mongering among Ukrainians. And this just shows you how Ukrainians are feeling right now. Of course, there is fear. Is there more fear today than yesterday after the strike with this new missile, intermediary missile on Dnipro? No, Ukrainians perfectly know by whom they are targeted, and they are under no illusion that this is going to stop by the sole will of Vladimir Putin, who also, again, according to the president, has no real wish to stop this war.
So we're hearing, as we're speaking, more information coming from agencies from the Kremlin suggesting that, quoting Vladimir Putin, saying there's no other weapons like the weapons that we have. Also, as well, news agencies from Reuters and AP suggesting that Ukraine is looking to obtain better quality, what they call the THAAD, the US Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Systems, upgrading its Patriot systems again. And also saying that this is a senior general in the armed forces quoted, saying that according to our data, the number of these new Russian experimental missile systems are limited. So that will be some relief in Kyiv. You mentioned, Emmanuel, as well, the attack on the Dnipro. Do we know the extent of the damage there?
Well, the army won't communicate on the extent of the damage for obvious strategic reasons. Now, the Ministry of Defense of Russia said that they had targeted an ammunition depot and industrial complex used by the Ukrainian military, and that the strike was successful. So there's no way that we can verify this, because the Ukrainian army will not confirm this. But what it shows is that Ukraine still is in need of more air defense system, not just regarding the strike here in Dnipro, but we also have to keep in mind that Ukraine and Ukrainians have been targeted all across the country daily since this summer. The numbers of air attacks, of aerial attacks, has really increased. Today, the city of Sumy was struck once again by drones, kamikaze drones, and this time, for the first time in the region of Sumy, says its governor, there were shrapnel pieces in those kamikaze drones. They cannot carry huge explosive charges, but putting shrapnel pieces there, that means they can inflict maximum damage on people. And those are not military we're talking about. Those are civilians we're talking about. And in doing so, Russia is committing yet another war crime as it targets civilians, which are not a legitimate target of war.
I mean, Emmanuel, great to talk to you. Emmanuel Shaz, our correspondent in Kyiv. Listening to that, General Ben Hodges, I'm interested in two things. One, when we listen to the rhetoric of Vladimir Putin saying there's, quote, nothing else like this experimental missile, it seems on the face of it, it is propaganda. But what's your assessment of that?
Well, first of all, I thought Emmanuel's report was very good. And I mean, she's there. And she said exactly what I would have expected, that Ukrainians are not more scared today than they were yesterday. They have been getting hit by the Russians starting 11 years ago, but intensively starting almost 3 years ago, as you pointed out. And of course, Russia has been using nuclear-capable weapons from the very beginning. So this is not, I mean, the headlines that came out yesterday and the day before, like, oh my God, this is possibly an ICBM, nuclear-capable. That's old news for the Ukrainians. But that's getting those kind of headlines, of course, is exactly what the Kremlin had hoped to achieve, is getting people alarmed. And I've seen Americans, some useful idiots talking about we're closer to World War III than ever. What a ridiculous statement by people that are not very well informed.
The other point, closer to home where you are right now, is what's going on in Germany. You talked about the open letter you put out in the past to the Brits, to the Americans, to allow the use of long-range missiles. There's still a no from the Scholz, what's left of the remnants of the Scholz government on the Taurus missile system, and their traffic light coalition has collapsed. What's your take on, first of all, the difficulty for the German government in doing that, and also what difference that would make?
Well, this has been a massive letdown or disappointment by by Bundeskanzler Scholz. I think most Germans would want to see, in fact, Germany is the second largest contributor of aid to Ukraine, but also Chancellor Scholz is, I think, excessively afraid of doing something where Germany would be held vulnerable by the Russians. Unlike France and unlike the UK, Germany does not have its own nuclear weapon, and I think that weighs heavily on the Bundeskanzler as he thinks about what to do. But I think that this is all going to change in February. There's elections in Germany, of course, and you've got people like Friedrich Merz from the CDU, who has said that if Russia doesn't stop, that he would immediately give Taurus to the Ukrainians. So he's going to be much more forward-leaning. And you've mentioned Annalena Baerbock a couple of times. She and Robert Habeck of the Green Party, I mean, they were arguing to provide weapons to Ukraine even before the large-scale invasion. So my view is that the majority of Germans want to see this done to help Ukraine. They understand the cost. If Ukraine fails, that Germany will probably be the biggest loser in terms of economic impact and refugees coming to Germany from Ukraine. It's just not going to happen as long as Scholz is still in power.
A final thought, Ben, is if you were advising the NATO leaders next week in this meeting with Ukraine over the assessment of defence assessment and what's happened, what would you be saying?
I would say that, number one, we have to be very clear about the strategic objective, about why we're doing this, and what is the outcome that we all want. And the outcome that we all want is for Ukraine to defeat Russia, push them back to the 1991 boundaries. If you do that, that would secure the European security environment. That would improve the European security environment for decades. If we don't, we'll have missed a huge opportunity.
Great to talk to you. Ben Hodges, retired American General, Lieutenant General, commanded in Afghanistan, Iraq, Commander General for the US Army in Europe. Thank you so much for your time this evening on France 24.
Thanks, Gavin.